At first glance, The Nesting looks like the kind of film that slipped through the cracks for a reason. A low-budget horror title from the early 1980s, a reclusive woman, an old house, birds behaving badly. For decades, it has been remembered as a strange footnote usually mentioned in the same breath as other animal horror films and then quickly left behind. But that reputation hides something uncomfortable, because The Nesting is not built like a typical horror film about things going wrong. Long before anything attacks the film is already unstable. The fear is already present. The isolation is already complete. What unfolds later does not introduce terror. It confirms it. Scene by scene, the film suggests that the danger was never arriving from the outside. It was already embedded in the space, the history, and the way the protagonist was taught to doubt her own perception. At the center of the story is a woman who cannot exist comfortably in public space. Her decision to retreat into a remote house is not driven by curiosity or courage, but by survival. The house promises silence, control, and distance from the world. What it actually contains is something much older. A structure shaped by violence that predates her by generations. A past that was never resolved, only sealed off and ignored. Released during a period when horror was increasingly sold through shock and spectacle, The Nesting was rarely approached on its own terms. Its slow pace was mistaken for emptiness. Its restraint was read as confusion. Its ambiguity was treated as a flaw instead of a warning sign. In many ways, the film was judged for what it refused to be. This video is not here to defend The Nesting, and it is not here to retell its story. Instead, it looks at 20 strange, overlooked, and often misunderstood facts surrounding the film. Details about its construction, its themes, and its reception that quietly change how it should be seen. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Nesting. 1. When The Nesting was released in 1981, it was marketed almost entirely as an animal horror film, a decision that quietly reshaped how audiences understood everything that followed. Posters, trailers, and promotional blurbs leaned heavily on the image of birds turning violent, echoing the lingering cultural shadow of the birds. To distributors, this was a practical move. Animal horror had a recognizable hook, and simplicity sold tickets. But the film itself was never structured around that promise. What makes this strange is how little narrative authority the birds actually have. For a large portion of the runtime, they barely register as a threat. They do not drive the story forward, nor do they dictate the protagonist's decisions. Instead, they linger at the edges, appearing sporadically and often without emphasis. The real tension is already in place long before their aggression escalates, rooted in isolation, psychological pressure, and the unsettling stillness of the house itself. By selling the film as something it was not, the marketing created a mismatch that shaped its reception. Audiences waited for spectacle. Critics looked for momentum. When neither arrived in the expected form, the film was labeled slow, confused, or derivative. Scenes designed to build atmosphere were read as filler. Restraint was mistaken for absence. This matters because it suggests the film's reputation was damaged before viewers ever encountered its actual intentions. The weird fact is not that The Nesting failed to deliver animal horror. It is that it was judged almost entirely on a framework it never agreed to operate within. If a film is introduced under the wrong promise, how many of its choices will be misread before the first scene even ends? 2. The protagonist's agoraphobia is established before any external threat appears, quietly defining the film's true source of tension. From the opening moments, her fear of public space is treated as an everyday condition rather than a dramatic twist. She struggles with movement exposure and the unpredictability of the outside world. This fear does not emerge in response to danger. It exists independently, shaping every decision she makes. What is unusual is how the film refuses to frame this condition as a flaw to be overcome. There is no arc promising recovery or triumph. Her retreat into a remote house is not portrayed as a mistake, but as a coping strategy. The house represents control, silence, and boundaries. For a time, it appears to work. Writing becomes possible again. Life slows. Fear feels contained. This inversion changes how later events function. When violence begins to surface, it does not introduce fear into her life. It repurposes fear that was already there. The house does not break her sense of safety. It mirrors it. isolation once protective becomes reinforcing. Without the outside world to test perception, ambiguity has nowhere to dissipate. The strange part is how consistently the film aligns the audience with this perspective. We experience confinement before threat anxiety, before explanation. By the time danger becomes visible, the psychological groundwork is already complete. If fear precedes the event that supposedly justifies it, the question is no longer what caused the fear, but why it was accurate. 3. The house's connection to violence during the American Civil War is introduced quietly, almost casually, yet it carries enormous interpretive weight. There is no dramatic reenactment, no lingering flashback designed to shock. Instead, the information surfaces through fragments, passing references, and understated discoveries. The film treats history not as spectacle, but as residue. This restraint is unusual for horror. Rather than presenting the house as cursed or possessed, the film frames it as burdened. Violence is not an anomaly tied to a supernatural event. It is part of a pattern that predates the protagonist by more than a century. The house has already witnessed brutality, confinement, and death. What unfolds in the present does not violate its nature. It repeats it. By anchoring the setting in the Civil War, the film connects private suffering to collective trauma. The protagonist's isolation echoes a much older isolation embedded in the structure itself. National history becomes spatial history. The walls do not remember actively, but they have never been cleared of what happened inside them. This reframes the idea of haunting entirely. Nothing arrives to disrupt the house. The disturbance was always there. It simply waits until someone quiet enough moves in to hear it. If violence can be inherited by a place, the real horror may not be what happens next, but what was never resolved before. 4. The film consistently frames the house as a space of observation rather than protection, a choice that becomes clear long before any overt violence occurs. Interior shots linger with an unusual patience. Doorways are held slightly too long. Windows are positioned not as sources of light, but as rigid boundaries between inside and outside. Even when nothing is happening, the camera behaves as if something is being monitored. This is strange because the house is initially meant to represent safety. For the protagonist, it is an intentional retreat, a controlled environment where exposure can be limited and anxiety reduced. Yet the visual language refuses to support that promise. The camera rarely aligns fully with her point of view. Instead, it maintains distance, often watching her move through rooms as if the space itself were studying her presence. What makes this detail important is its consistency. The framing does not suddenly change when danger escalates. It is already in place from the beginning. The film teaches the audience how to look before it tells them what to see. The house is not framed as hostile, but it is never framed as neutral either. By treating the environment as an observer rather than a shelter, the film subtly reverses the expected power dynamic. The protagonist may occupy the house, but she never fully claims it. She adapts to it. She moves within its rules. Over time, the space feels less like a refuge and more like a system that absorbs her routines and reflects them back. If this were accidental, it would fluctuate or resolve. It does neither. The house remains visually dominant even in moments of calm. Safety is suggested but never confirmed. The unsettling implication is that isolation does not remove scrutiny. It simply changes who or what is doing the watching. 5. Unlike many horror films centered on animal aggression, the nesting delays the bird's transformation into a threat until after multiple forms of disruption have already occurred. They exist in the environment from early on, but they are not emphasized. Their presence is ordinary, almost incidental. They become dangerous only after boundaries have been crossed and buried elements of the house's past have been disturbed. This sequencing matters. The birds do not initiate chaos. They respond to it. Renovations alter the structure. Hidden spaces are uncovered. Objects tied to historical violence are unearthed. Each intrusion destabilizes the environment slightly, and only then does nature react. The bird's behavior escalates alongside these disturbances, rather than independently of them. What makes this weird is how easily the film could have centered the animals as antagonists. It never fully commits to that path. The birds are never individualized. They are not granted intention or personality. They function more like signals than villains. Their aggression marks a shift in equilibrium rather than the arrival of evil. This reframes the violence entirely. Instead of asking why the birds attacked, the film quietly asks what changed in the space that made such attacks possible. Nature does not punish, it answers. The response may be extreme, but it is not random. If the birds are reacting rather than initiating, then the real disturbance lies elsewhere. The question becomes less about survival and more about accountability. 6. Male authority figures throughout the film consistently reinterpret the protagonist's fear as a psychological inconvenience rather than a meaningful warning. Doctors' acquaintances and institutional voices offer explanations designed to contain her distress instead of investigate it. Anxiety is treated as something to manage, not something to listen to. What is unsettling is the tone of these interactions. The dismissals are not cruel or aggressive. They are calm, professional, and reassuring. Authority does not silence her through force. It silences her through confidence. By labeling her fear as internal noise, the system renders it irrelevant to external decision-making. This pattern has tangible consequences. Delays occur. Concerns are minimized. Opportunities for intervention disappear. The protagonist becomes increasingly isolated not only by her condition and her environment, but by the repeated suggestion that her perception cannot be trusted. Placed within the film's broader structure, this dynamic mirrors its historical themes. Violence that is normalized through distance. Warnings that arrive before evidence is considered acceptable. Systems that outlast individuals while quietly failing them. The weird fact is not that the protagonist is afraid. It is that her fear consistently aligns with unfolding events while being treated as a liability. If authority only responds once danger becomes undeniable, how many warnings are lost in the meantime? 7. As the story progresses, isolation in. The nesting stops functioning as a temporary condition and begins operating as a closed system that slowly reshapes perception. Early on, solitude appears stabilizing. The protagonist writes more easily. Her routine settles. The absence of social pressure feels like relief. But the film gradually removes external reference points that would normally correct or challenge interpretation. Days begin to blur without clear markers. Scenes repeat with slight variations. Familiar rooms feel subtly altered, not because they change, but because attention does. Without consistent interaction, thoughts echo back on themselves. Fear is no longer tested against the outside world. It circulates internally, refining itself rather than dissipating. What makes this strange is the film's refusal to signal a clear psychological break. There is no dramatic descent, no moment that announces unreliability. Instead, perception shifts incrementally. The audience experiences this alongside the protagonist sharing the same limited information and the same narrowing field of interpretation. This approach aligns isolation with realism rather than madness. The film suggests that distortion does not require delusion. It only requires duration. Given enough time without contradiction, uncertainty begins to feel intentional. Ambiguity starts to read as threat. By the time danger becomes unmistakable, the groundwork has already been laid. Fear feels earned, not exaggerated. The isolation did not cause the violence. It removed resistance to recognizing it. If perception changes slowly enough, the unsettling question is not when it became unreliable, but whether anyone inside it would ever notice the difference. 8. The discovery of hidden rooms and concealed spaces in the house mirrors the uncovering of suppressed history rather than accidental exploration. These moments are not staged as shocks or triumphs. There is no celebratory reveal, no sense of conquest. The spaces appear as omissions finally being corrected. The protagonist does not seek these areas out of curiosity. She encounters them through necessity, renovation, and routine interaction with the structure. The house does not resist discovery, nor does it invite it. It simply yields when its surface is disturbed. This creates a subtle but important distinction. The past is not summoned, it is exposed. By framing these discoveries as inevitable, the film links physical space to psychological process. Just as the protagonist cannot remain untouched by what the house contains, the house cannot remain sealed indefinitely. Buried elements resurface not because they are called forth, but because silence is unsustainable. This treatment reframes the idea of haunting. There is no external force demanding attention. The disturbance lies in what was never addressed. The hidden spaces are not secrets. They are deferred truths. The weirdness lies in how calmly the film treats this revelation. History does not explode into the present, it seeps. If suppressed violence always returns, eventually the real variable is not whether it resurfaces, but how much damage occurs before it does. 9. Rather than escalating tension through constant increase in threat, the nesting relies on accumulation, a structural choice that directly affected how the film was received. Scenes revisit the same spaces under slightly altered conditions. Similar actions repeat with minor deviations. The film builds pressure through comparison instead of surprise. This pacing demands sustained attention. Meaning emerges slowly, not through revelation, but through pattern recognition. For viewers expecting traditional horror rhythms, this can feel stagnant. Without clear peaks or cues, the experience becomes uncomfortable in a different way. Fear is not delivered, it is absorbed. At the time of release, this restraint worked against the film. Critics often described it as unfocused or underdeveloped. The lack of obvious escalation was interpreted as indecision. But when viewed closely, the consistency of this approach suggests intention rather than failure. The film does not want fear to feel episodic. It wants it to feel environmental, always present, occasionally visible, rarely resolved. The pacing mirrors the protagonist's internal state where tension never fully releases, only shifts location. This reframes slowness as strategy. The absence of constant stimulation becomes part of the effect. Dread accumulates because it is not allowed to discharge. If horror is meant to reflect lived anxiety rather than spectacle escalation, may not be the most honest structure. 10. Sound in the nesting is used less as guidance and more as intrusion, a choice that quietly destabilizes how the audience reads every scene. Large portions of the film unfold without musical reinforcement. There is no constant score instructing when to feel safe or when to anticipate danger. Silence dominates moments that would traditionally be filled with tension-building music. This absence changes the listening experience entirely. Without sonic cues, every noise becomes ambiguous. A faint movement could be environmental or internal. A sudden sound does not escalate from music. It breaks into silence. The result is not shock, but violation. Calm is not replaced by fear. It is interrupted by it. What makes this strange is how consistently the film commits to this restraint. Even scenes that seem designed for musical emphasis are allowed to remain quiet. When sound does appear, it often feels misaligned with expectation. It arrives too early or too late. It refuses to confirm what the image suggests. This approach mirrors the protagonist's psychological state. She is constantly listening, constantly, uncertain whether what she perceives is significant. The audience is placed in the same position. We are not told when to be afraid. We are forced to decide for ourselves without confirmation. In many horror films, music acts as reassurance. It signals that fear is controlled and scheduled. The nesting removes that safety net. Silence becomes fragile. Sound becomes invasive. The weird fact is that this choice makes even neutral moments feel unstable. Nothing has to happen for tension to exist. It is enough that something could happen. When sound stops guiding interpretation, fear no longer belongs to the film. It belongs to the viewer. 11. The protagonist's profession as a writer is not a background detail, but a structural element that shapes how reality is constructed in the film. Writing is an act of isolation. It requires sustained attention, inward prolonged solitude, and constant interpretation. These qualities mirror the conditions under which the film's events unfold. The house is not just lived in, it is read. The protagonist observes details, revisits spaces, and reinterprets earlier moments the way a writer revises a draft. Meaning is not immediate, it accumulates. Scenes feel less like incidents and more like paragraphs being reconsidered. What makes this weird is that the film never frames this process as delusion. Her interpretive instinct is not mocked. It is questioned by others, but rarely disproven. She notices patterns that authority figures dismiss. She connects fragments that seem insignificant until they are not. By anchoring the story in a writer's perspective, the film complicates the idea of unreliable narration. The problem is not that perception is flawed. The problem is that interpretation lacks institutional support. Her insights exist without validation, making them easy to ignore. This dynamic shifts the power balance. Reality is not determined by accuracy alone, but by who is allowed to define it. The protagonist may see clearly, but clarity does not grant authority. The strange implication is that storytelling itself becomes a survival skill. Not because it invents meaning, but because it preserves it when systems refuse to listen. If reality must be narrated to be believed, what happens when the narrator is dismissed before the story is finished? 12. When violence finally occurs in The Nesting, it is staged to feel abrupt and unsatisfying rather than climactic. There is little buildup and even less release. The scenes arrive suddenly, fracture the moment, and leave behind confusion rather than clarity. Violence does not explain what came before. It fails to resolve it. This is unusual for horror, where violent moments often function as narrative punctuation. They reward tension with payoff. Here, violence disrupts rather than completes. The aftermath lingers awkwardly. Damage remains without interpretation. There is no sense of victory, punishment, or balance restored. What makes this strange is how deliberately the film avoids catharsis. The audience is not invited to feel relief. Waiting is not rewarded. Instead, violence feels wrong in a way that refuses to become meaningful. It exists as consequence, not conclusion. This aligns with the film's broader refusal to moralize. Violence does not teach a lesson. It does not correct behavior. It exposes the cost of prolonged neglect, dismissal, and accumulation. When it arrives, it feels out of place because it is out of place. The film seems to suggest that violence is not an answer waiting to be revealed. It is a breakdown that arrives when no answers remain. If violence explains nothing and resolves nothing, then what exactly were we waiting for it to do? 13. Sexuality in The Nesting is deliberately muted, and that absence functions as a structural choice rather than a limitation. In many horror films of the late 70s and early 80s, sexuality operates as a shortcut. Desire becomes motivation. Transgression becomes explanation. Violence is framed as consequence. The Nesting quietly refuses this logic. The protagonist is not defined through erotic tension or moral temptation. Her vulnerability does not stem from desire, nor is it framed as punishment. Intimacy exists, but it is cautious, restrained, and narratively secondary. Physical closeness never promises safety, transformation, or control. Relationships remain peripheral, never elevated into solutions. What makes this strange is how much interpretive weight this removes. Without sexual motivation, the audience loses an easy framework for assigning blame or meaning. There is no behavioral trigger to point to, no moment that can be isolated and labeled as the cause. Violence emerges without a moral entry point. This forces attention elsewhere. Fear must be traced to space history and systems rather than personal choice. The protagonist does not suffer because she crossed a line. She suffers because she exists within structures that predate her and dismiss her perception. By stripping sexuality of explanatory power, the film denies the audience narrative comfort. There is no lesson about restraint or consequence to extract. The discomfort has no ethical resolution, it simply remains. The weird fact is that this absence makes the film more unsettling. Without desire as a narrative engine, violence cannot be rationalized. It becomes contextual rather than corrective. If horror often relies on desire to justify harm, what happens when harm arrives without that justification at all? 14. Rather than assigning responsibility to a single antagonist, The Nesting disperses threat across overlapping systems that never fully cohere into one identifiable enemy. There is no clear villain to confront, no force whose removal would restore order. Danger accumulates through interaction rather than intention. Psychological fragility intersects with historical residue. Environmental disturbance overlaps with institutional dismissal. Isolation amplifies uncertainty, while authority minimizes it. Each element contributes partially, but none are sufficient on their own. The result is a form of horror without a face. This diffusion has a profound narrative effect. Without a central antagonist, the audience cannot anticipate resolution through confrontation. Escape feels temporary. Intervention feels delayed. Even survival lacks clarity. The film refuses to provide a target for fear, leaving it suspended in systems rather than individuals. What makes this strange is how calmly the film accepts this condition. It does not scramble to recenter threat. It allows ambiguity to persist. Responsibility remains distributed, making accountability difficult to assign. This choice mirrors real experiences of harm that emerge from convergence rather than conspiracy. No one act explains the outcome. No single force can be blamed. Damage occurs because multiple failures align. By avoiding a villain, the film resists catharsis. There is no triumph in recognition. The horror does not end when something is defeated because nothing ever was. If no one is fully responsible, the unsettling question becomes not who caused this, but how it was allowed to continue for so long. 15. Early critical responses to The Nesting frequently interpreted its restraint as incompetence, revealing more about expectation than execution. Reviews at the time often cited slow pacing, tonal inconsistency, and lack of clear motivation as evidence that the film did not know what it wanted to be. Ambiguity was framed as confusion. Silence was read as emptiness. This reaction is telling. The criteria used to evaluate the film were calibrated toward clarity, escalation, and payoff. The Nesting systematically withholds all three. It delays explanation. It resists momentum. It concludes without resolution. In doing so, it violates genre expectations without announcing that it intends to. What makes this weird is how consistent the film is in these refusals. Scenes that seem underdeveloped follow the same logic as those that appear deliberate. Nothing rushes to clarify itself. Nothing arrives to reassure the viewer that understanding is imminent. With distance, these choices read differently. What was once labeled hesitation appears controlled. What was criticized as vagueness aligns with thematic fragmentation. The film's method becomes visible only when judged by a framework it was never designed to satisfy. Reception itself becomes a form of evidence. It demonstrates how easily a work can be misread when it refuses to perform familiarity. The film did not fail to communicate. It communicated in a language audiences were not prepared to listen to. If a story is evaluated by the wrong standards, its perceived flaws may be the clearest indicators of its actual intent. 16. As The Nesting approaches its final movement, the film prioritizes disorientation over explanation, denying the audience a clean psychological or narrative release. Events begin to accelerate, but understanding does not follow. Spatial relationships blur. Cause and effect become difficult to trace. Instead of clarifying what has been happening, the film allows confusion to intensify. This is strange because climaxes in horror are usually designed to organize fear. The threat is named confronted or destroyed. Even ambiguity is often resolved into a single dominant reading. The Nesting refuses that structure. The ending does not explain earlier unease. It amplifies it. The viewer is not guided toward certainty, only toward overload. What makes this choice significant is how closely it aligns with the protagonist's internal state. Control does not return. Perspective does not stabilize. Survival, if it exists, does not equal comprehension. The film does not reward endurance with insight. It ends in exhaustion rather than triumph. This reframes the climax as psychological rather than narrative. The story does not close a loop. It reaches a point where continuation would be unbearable. The disorientation feels intentional, as if the film is less concerned with finishing its argument than with leaving the audience inside it. The weird fact is that the lack of resolution is not accidental. It mirrors the film's central claim that some experiences do not become clear at the moment they end. If clarity only comes after distance, then the ending's confusion may be the most honest outcome available. 17. Throughout. The Nesting violence is presented without clear moral framing, allowing it to exist without justification, lesson, or corrective purpose. Actions are rarely labeled as right or wrong. Decisions are driven by fear, necessity, or confusion rather than conviction. When harm occurs, the film observes it without commentary. This neutrality is deeply unsettling. Horror often reassures audiences by attaching meaning to violence. Punishment restores balance. Survival confirms virtue. In The Nesting, violence does neither. It arrives abruptly, leaves damage behind, and refuses to explain itself. There is no narrative reward for enduring it. What makes this strange is how consistently the film avoids moral shorthand. The protagonist is not punished for curiosity or transgression. Others are not clearly condemned for failure. The film does not frame suffering as deserved or instructive. It simply shows that harm can occur in the absence of clear fault. This approach aligns with the film's historical undercurrent. The violence tied to the house's past is not moralized either. It is presented as something that happened, something that was normalized, and something that left residue. The present repeats the pattern without commentary. By refusing to attach lessons to violence, the film denies the audience emotional distance. There is no reassurance that meaning will emerge later. Harm remains unresolved, unredeemed, and uncontained. The weird implication is that violence is not a turning point in the story. It is evidence of a system failing quietly over time. If suffering does not carry a message, the question shifts from what it teaches to why it was allowed to happen at all. 18. The long-term reevaluation of the nesting is closely tied to changing cultural conversations around psychological trauma and perception. At the time of its release, anxiety and isolation were often treated as character weaknesses rather than interpretive lenses. Fear was something to overcome, not something that could reveal truth. As that framework has shifted, the film has begun to read differently. Agoraphobia is now understood as a serious condition, not a quirk or excuse. Isolation is recognized as destabilizing rather than eccentric. Viewed through this lens, many of the film's choices feel less opaque and more deliberate. This does not retroactively make the film flawless, but it alters how its restraint is interpreted. What once seemed hesitant now appears cautious. What once felt underwritten now feels respectful. The film's refusal to explain itself aligns more closely with lived psychological experience than with genre convention. What makes this weird is how dependent meaning becomes on timing. The film did not change. The audience did. Tools for interpretation evolved, allowing patterns that were once dismissed to become visible. Legacy in this sense is not fixed. A work can exist for decades before the conditions needed to understand it fully are in place. The nesting appears to be one of those cases. If interpretation depends on cultural readiness, how many other films remain unread, not because they failed, but because the audience arrived too early? 19. The ending of The Nesting refuses to separate personal survival from historical continuity, and that refusal fundamentally alters how the film should be read. Even when immediate danger appears to subside, nothing in the film suggests that the underlying conditions have been resolved. The house remains. Its past remains. The systems that dismissed warning signs remain unchanged. This is unusual because survival in horror often functions as closure. Escaping the threat implies victory. Endurance becomes proof that the story has reached a moral or emotional conclusion. The Nesting quietly rejects that logic. Survival, if it occurs, feels temporary rather than triumphant. It interrupts the violence without correcting the forces that enabled it. What makes this strange is how deliberately the film avoids reassurance. There is no visual language of relief. No suggestion that the space has been cleansed or neutralized. The protagonist may leave, but the structure that shaped her experience continues to exist untouched by consequence. The past is not confronted. It is merely exited. By doing this, the film reframes its ending away from resolution and toward continuity. The events we witness are not an anomaly in the house's history. They are part of an ongoing pattern. What ends is not the cycle itself, but our access to it. This shifts the emotional weight of the conclusion. The discomfort does not come from what happens next. It comes from the implication that what happened before will happen again to someone else in the same space. If a story ends without closure, it may not be unfinished. It may be acknowledging that some structures outlast the people harmed by them. 20. Across the film, fear is consistently framed as something to be managed, minimized, or dismissed. Yet it ultimately proves to be the most accurate form of perception available. The protagonist senses instability long before it becomes visible. She reacts to threat before institutions do. Her anxiety does not invent danger. It identifies it. This inversion is subtle but decisive. The Nesting does not portray fear as empowerment, nor does it romanticize suffering. Instead, it presents fear as sensitivity. an attunement to risk shaped by lived experience rather than authority or reassurance. What others label dysfunction, the film treats as responsiveness. Placed at the end of the 20 facts, this idea reframes everything that came before. The house's history, the isolation, the dismissals, the violence. Fear was never the obstacle to understanding. It was the signal that understanding was necessary. The tragedy is not that the protagonist was afraid. It is that her fear was consistently translated into silence. What makes this weird is how closely fear aligns with reality throughout the film. Again and again, it points in the right direction while being treated as noise. The system fails not because it lacks information, but because it refuses to recognize where that information is coming from. By ending on this note, the film leaves the audience with an uncomfortable question. If fear is accurate more often than authority, then the problem is not fear itself. The problem is who gets believed when fear speaks. One of the strangest and most overlooked aspects of The Nesting is that the film never treats fear as something to be cured, escaped, or overcome. From beginning to end, fear is not positioned as an illness with a solution. It is treated as a condition of awareness that exists because something is wrong, not because the character is broken. This runs against the dominant narrative logic of both horror and psychological drama. Typically, fear is framed as an obstacle, a flaw to be conquered so that normal life can resume. In The Nesting, normal life is never presented as a stable option. The outside world is overwhelming. The interior space is contaminated by history. Institutions are dismissive. There is no safe baseline to return to. What makes this especially unsettling is that the film never offers an alternative state of being. There is no moment where fear is replaced by clarity or confidence. Even at the end, what remains is not understanding, but survival without certainty. Fear does not disappear because the conditions that generated it never disappear. This suggests a darker interpretation. Fear in The Nesting is not a reaction to extraordinary circumstances. It is a rational response to systems that consistently fail to protect, listen, or resolve past violence. The house is not dangerous because it is haunted. It is dangerous because it is allowed to remain unresolved. Fear persists because nothing fundamentally changes. The bonus fact is this: the film does not ask what happens when fear takes over. It asks what happens when fear is correct and everyone else insists on treating it as a mistake. That question lingers long after the film ends, precisely because it offers no comforting answer. If The Nesting left you unsettled, the question is not whether it worked as a horror film, but what kind of horror it was really trying to show. Which fact changed the way you see the film the most? Was it the role of isolation, the weight of history inside the house, or the idea that fear itself was the most reliable signal in the story? Do you think The Nesting was misunderstood because of its time or because audiences were never meant to feel comfortable with what it was saying? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which overlooked film we should examine next.